last week, as I was preparing for last week's sermon, a kid's song that I learned as a kid came to mind, and it still was in there in the recesses of my long-term memory, and it came back to my mind this week. And maybe you know it, maybe you don't, but it's "I Just Want to Be a Sheep." Ba 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 ba. You ever heard that one? Maybe not. Okay. Well, there's two verses of that song that talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, whom we met last week in Acts chapter 23, who helped make up the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious ruling council, and Paul is standing before them on trial. And I'm not going to sing the verses, but let me give you the lyrics of the song about these two groups. I don't want to be a Pharisee. Don't want to be a Pharisee because they're not fair, you see. Don't want to be a Pharisee. Ring a bell? Anyone know that song? No. Okay. Well, I'm still not going to sing it. Then about the Sadducees. Don't want to be a Sadducee. Don't want to be a Sadducee because they're so sad, you see. Don't want to be a Sadducee. Look it up later if you don't know it. But it's a song that I learned growing up. And at the time when I was a kid, I didn't know who either of those groups were. It was just part of a song. I mean, I probably heard it in the Bible teaching, but still, I didn't know anything about those two groups. Who are the Sadducees and the Pharisees? And we learned a little bit about them last week. And Paul knows who they are for sure in our passage last week. And he noticed that there was both groups represented in the Sanhedrin, if you remember, from Acts 23. And he picked up on that rivalry between them and that antagonism between them, especially as it regarded what he says he stands on trial for, the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Just ringing a bell at all from last week? Well, Paul says that that's what he stands on trial for. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. And as I started my preparations this week, which I was going to just continue on in Acts 23, I thought I needed to pause there a little bit more on this hope of the resurrection of the dead, because that's what Paul says he stands on trial for. And we're going to do that by looking at Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Mark chapter 3. He has his own conversations and debate about the very same thing in Mark chapter 12. Now, not with the Pharisees, that's a different debate. Maybe you remember what happens. They want to try to trick him or entrap him with a question about paying taxes to Caesar or not. You remember how Jesus answered them? He asked for a denarius, and he says, whose picture's on it? Caesar. Then pay unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. Their plan failed. Their trap didn't work. So the Pharisees decide that they're going to try their hand at Jesus. And Mark specifically notes that the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And yet they come with a question about the resurrection. And I want you to think about, do you think that they're going to fare any better than the Pharisees did? Here was their question in Mark chapter 12. If you turn there, Mark chapter 12, verses 18 through 23. This is the word of the Lord. Then the Sadducees, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no child. It was the same way with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 married her? The word of the Lord. If you remember from last week, and if you weren't here last week, I'll share this. Craig Keener says the Sadducees prospered due to their relationship with the Romans. They were in close partnership with them. That is, they pacified the people for the Romans and the Romans for the people. So they got their position that way through their partnership with the Roman oppressors, which the people didn't take too kindly to, others know, because of this cozy arrangement. They didn't like that. So they didn't have the favor of the people, but they had the favor of the Romans. And there is something good about the Sadducees, though. They wanted to base any matters of faith and morals on scriptural authority alone, over against the Pharisees, who added tradition and their own interpretation of the law as authoritative. And yet, even though this was the Sadducees' position, they also limited Scripture to only the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this is the group that comes to Jesus about this question of the resurrection, about the resurrection. But their question is disingenuous. They don't really want Jesus' opinion on this. They're trying to prove how irrational and ridiculous such a belief is. That's what they're trying to do, at least. The Sadducees based their question on the law in Deuteronomy 25. David Gusick says this is called levirate marriage, and they go through this whole story about 7 brothers who married the same woman. And the law was, if one brother died, then another brother would marry that widow in order to give that person a son and an heir, so that their land wouldn't be lost and their inheritance would be preserved, as well as the family name. That was the law that they're bringing up in their question. And it isn't just one brother, notice, that dies in the story. They kind of pour it on. It's 7 altogether that die, leaving her no children. And then finally the woman dies too, they say. Now, you can almost hear the sarcasm in their question. So tell us, whose wife will she be? And I almost imagine they didn't have this back then, probably, but we have it now, air quotes, in the resurrection. For them, the resurrection of the dead is illogical when an example like this is set forth. And they think they've got Jesus penned. They think they've got him cornered. Maybe they even tried this argument on Pharisees and they couldn't answer them. So they think that they've got Jesus pinned down with their impeccable argument and story. Until Jesus answers. Until Jesus answers. We're not going to get there yet. I want you to notice the one good point the Sadducees do make. Death is a reality. Every one of us will die unless we're alive at the return of Christ. Everyone will face death unless, again, we're alive at the return of Christ. The question is, what happens after we die? You know what the Sadducees said? Extinction. That's just it. There's nothing more. That's it. That's not what Christians believe, is it? That's not what we believe. When somebody dies, what happens? What happens when a believer dies? Let me give you 3 passages that will help us with that question. You remember when Jesus is on the cross and there is a thief right next to him who said, "Remember me, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom." What is Jesus' reply? "Today you will be with me in paradise." Today. Be with me in paradise, Jesus says. Then in the passage that we read this morning in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, did you hear what we read? That's why I like when we read it out loud, because we have to verbalize what we're also hearing. Did you hear what it said in 2 Corinthians 5:8? "We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord." Finally, a third passage to help us, Philippians 1:21 through 24. "For to me, to live is Christ and die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what should I choose? I don't know. I'm torn between the 2. Listen, I desire to depart and be with Christ. which is far better. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. So we can say that when believers die, we go to be with the Lord, depart and be with Christ. Right? But what happens to the body when we leave? Many believers believe that the soul or the spirit is the real person, and this body that we have is just an earthly shell that we've got to live with while we're here on earth. And that is just something that we actually escape in death, and it's not really that important. At the very least, that's the idea. Or really, the implication is the body is an evil to be escaped. And let me illustrate what this was happening, beginning to happen right before the letters of Paul were being written, as well as later letters. And it was an influence of a heresy called Gnosticism, which believed that the spirit or the soul was good and the body was evil. That is not the biblical understanding of who we are. The biblical understanding, or this is also dualistic or Platonic, maybe for those words, the biblical understanding is that a person is heart, soul, mind, and body. And while there are distinctions between those, the person is the whole of the person is a unity. All those together. So the body isn't evil. It's part of what needs to be redeemed. That's part of the hope that Paul is talking about. That's the more biblical. That is the biblical view that I learned from the text that we studied in my classes with Dr. Hahn and others. Heart, soul, mind, and body are to be taken as the whole person. And so not just the soul is redeemed, but the Lord intends to redeem all of us, including the body. That's why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 15 or 5, read this morning, while we're in this tent, the earthly body, we groan and are burdened because we don't wish to be unclothed, but instead be further clothed with our heavenly dwelling. That which is mortal be swallowed up in life. He's referring to the hope of the resurrection of the dead, or our resurrection bodies. Stick with me here. Okay? So when we die, we are with the Lord, but we also await the hope of the resurrection of the dead when he comes again. Here's how Romans 8:24 puts it. Not only so, but we ourselves have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as children, the redemption of our bodies. Here's how Philippians 3:20 and 21 put it. This tells us when it will happen. But our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from heaven, the Lord Jesus, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that it will be like his glorious body. Here's how our manual states it, picking up on John chapter 5. We believe in the resurrection of the dead, that the bodies, both of the just and the unjust, shall be raised to life and united with their spirits. They that have done good unto the resurrection of life, they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. Quoting Jesus, that's what Jesus says in John 5:25 through 29. The Sadducees believe none of this. That's why they're so sad, you see. That's why they're so sad, you see. And yet, notice in the passage, they are so confident in their little story that they've come up with to Jesus. They think they've got him cornered and pinned. But now Jesus answers and they realize that actually they are badly mistaken. Look at the rest of this passage, 24 to 27. Jesus replied, "Are you not in error because you don't know the scriptures or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken." So their disingenuous question is met immediately directly with Jesus' answer and the truth. He doesn't hold back there, does he? He directly addresses their question and gets right to it, strongly refuting their presumption that there is no resurrection. I love how the Message puts it. Jesus said, you're way off base, and here's why. One, you don't know what God said, and two, you don't know how God works. Douglas Hare says, by denying the resurrection, the Sadducees are denying God's power. Their God is too small. Let me ask a question this way that'll help us further dig into this. What can we learn about the resurrection of the dead based on Jesus' interaction with the Sadducees? Here's the first insight. Jesus believes in the hope of the resurrection of the dead, or to better state it, he is the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Through his own real death, his own literal death and bodily resurrection. I don't think we always get this, but that's why the empty tomb is so important. When Jesus was raised from the dead, it wasn't as a floating spirit. He was raised with his body. You remember all the appearances, the encounters that he had with the disciples? How the women clutched at his feet holding on to him. How he ate a piece of fish in the presence of the disciples. How he showed the wounds that he had to his disciples, and then later invited Thomas to touch his hands and his side. But it was also obvious that this was not the same body as before, because he's going through doors when the doors are locked and the disciples are meeting. And he disappears from the presence of the two on the road to Emmaus. His is a glorified body. And it's clear then that he's won the victory and death no longer has hold of him. And his resurrection is the first fruits of our own. 1 Corinthians 15. Revelation 1:5. He's the firstborn of the dead. This is all part of the hope that Paul is standing on and part of what's being communicated here. Douglas Hare clarifies, belief in the resurrection of the dead, of decayed bodies, seems like a foolish superstition to many then, like the Pharisees, as now. But the New Testament writers make it clear that when they speak of the resurrection, they're not thinking of the restoration of physical bodies to their pre-death state, but rather to a glorified state, as Jesus' resurrection was. Okay, let me show you that in 1 Corinthians 15. Turn there if you want to. And look at some of these verses, how it puts it. That lays out what our resurrection bodies will be like. You remember that? We went through it last week. The body that's sown perishable is raised imperishable. Verse 42 through 44. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. Jesus adds another dimension of what our resurrection life will be like here in Mark 12. Look at verse 25, the NLT puts it. For when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. In this respect, they will be like the angels in heaven. I want you to see an important distinction here. Jesus does not say that we become angels when we die. Okay? We don't become angels. The resurrection body that we receive later doesn't have wings on it. Okay? But he says we'll be like the angels in heaven. What does he mean? David McKenna says, persons will retain their identity and individuality in heaven. That is, we're going to be ourselves. Well, I'll still be Eric. You'll still be who you are. We'll be ourselves. We'll be able to be identified by the power of God, but they will transform the human ordinances that guided their relationships on earth. Marriage, the most sacred of these ordinances, prefigures the relationship of full communion with God and his angels. Family relationships will be transcended by this perfect communion. That's what it means to be like the angels. There will be perfect communion with God and others. David Gusick suggests that the Sadducees, part of their sarcasm was they thought if there was a resurrection, it would just be like this life now, just lived on into the future forever. But with this principle, he says, Jesus showed that the age to come, our lives will be lived on a completely different principle and in a completely different dimension that we can't imagine. We don't know what it'll be like. It won't be the same the life that we know on earth, but we can't say for sure what it will be like. Listen, other than we won't be disappointed. Whoever puts their hope in the Lord will not be put to shame, Paul says. When I read his quote there, that we won't be disappointed, it jogged my memory to a conversation that Lois Jones shared with me a number of years ago. She used to be a member here, was the piano player. She said, Lord, why don't we know more what that life will be like when we're forever with you in heaven? Why don't we know more? She wanted to know more. She was thinking about that for some reason, trying to figure that out, reading the scriptures. Why don't we know more? And the Holy Spirit said, listen, if you knew what it would be like, you would lose the will to live. You will not be disappointed what God has in store for his people. You can't even imagine or fathom what he has in store for you. If you know him, you can read through the scriptures, and it's even better than you can understand or imagine. So good that you would lose the will to live if you knew in full what it would be like. You will not be disappointed in the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. I hope you grab onto that today. The second insight from this conversation that Jesus has with the Sadducees is that this hope of the resurrection is based on the scriptures, not the tradition of the Pharisees. From Acts 23, we might have said, well, that's just one of the religious debates that they were having, and just one of the partisan issues that they were arguing about. Jesus makes it clear, no, that's not the case at all. This is a hope promised by God, who is the God of the living and not the dead. So how does Jesus address that? He could have brought up passages like Daniel chapter 12, which speak about the resurrection. Multitudes who sleep in the dust will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. But he doesn't do that because, remember, the Sadducees only hold to the first 5 books of the Bible. So he goes with Exodus 3:6. I can almost see the faces of the Sadducees. They thought they had it good. And he brings up Exodus 3:6, the account of the burning bush, where Jesus says he's not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. You're badly mistaken. He revealed himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I love what John Wesley says about this. He says, that is, since the character of his being the God of any persons plainly intimates a relationship to them, not as dead, but as living. And since he cannot be said to be at present their God at all, if they are utterly dead, nor to be the God of human persons such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, consisting of souls and bodies, if their bodies were to abide in everlasting death, there must be then a future state of blessedness and a resurrection body to share in it. We can't go into more of that. I wish I could, but that's the second insight here. The third and last one, insight from this conversation Jesus has with the Sadducees is, God's power will accomplish our resurrection just as it did Jesus' resurrection. In Ephesians, it says that God's mighty strength was exerted to raise Jesus from the dead. And it's that same power that will give us a new glorious body, as Philippians says, that our lowly bodies will be transformed. God's power will do that. We too shall rise, 1 Corinthians 15 says. Our bodies will be redeemed. So listen, our hope isn't that we escape the body in this world. Our hope is that God will redeem all of who we are, including all of creation, by the way. He's making all things new. And even our bodies will be redeemed. And will be given a glorious resurrection body when he comes again. That's what Paul says he staked his ministry and life on. That's why he's gone through all the struggles and hardships and persecutions for this hope of the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus' death and bodily resurrection is the basis of this sure hope. So don't be a Sadducee. Don't be a Pharisee either. They had the right theology on this issue, but they were more concerned about outward appearances and the praise of people. And so don't be like the Pharisees either, but don't be a Sadducee, because they're so sad, you see. If we have hope for this life only, Paul says, we're most to be pitied, and that's all the Sadducees had. Remember, they thought that death was an extinction. But Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of our own resurrection. So don't be a Sadducee. They're so sad, you see. But when the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, 1 Corinthians 15, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Suzanne, if you come forward, we're going to sing a hymn of response that picks up on this hope that we've been talking about today. And I want you to especially pay attention to verse 2, because it puts this hope into lyrics as we sing in response. I would invite you to stand and sing, "When the roll